Mr. Donald Whelan and Mr. GETHIN John to kickstart the student seminar. Please give a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me with my cup of tea. It's like being in the studio. I always have a cup of tea when I'm working in the studio. So yes, welcome everybody. Thank you to Smita and Pooja and Anilsa from Palm for letting us have this session here. Last year we came to you. We came to the audio guys, we came to Mumbai Music Institute, and we live at Sound Ideas when we're in Mumbai. And this year we thought it'd be nice to get everybody together here and give you all a taste of the expo and the craziness of these huge rooms full of equipment. So yeah, we're just here to talk to you about our work, mastering, and to talk you through some of the fundamentals of it. What we do, how we do it, what our approach is. We got 2 hours, so we're going to speak for maybe 90 minutes, then we can have a good long session for questions and answers, so please keep your questions. We can have a nice, we love that part, there's often some really interesting discussions that come out of your questions. We can tell you the stuff you want to know, rather than what we think you want to know. So we'll kick off with the really basic question. I'm going to ask you, Gethin, if you would, what is mastering? It's the most basic question.
It is like the fundamental question of everything that we do. So mastering, and a lot of you will already understand and know this, but what mastering is the very last time anyone is going to touch the audio before it's released onto a platform. So the very last time a trained engineer touches the audio before it goes to YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever it's going. So that's where we are in the process, is right at the end. And what we think of it as, or what we bring, is I like to break down into 2 parts. The first is audio greatness, right? How good can we make this thing sound? How great can we make this track sound? So that's one of the things. It's something that we're trying to bring all the way through the process, but it's something we focus on at mastering as well. The second thing is consistency, which is a slightly maybe boring word, but it's really, really important. Is a track consistent within itself? Do we have an intro that's really, really quiet, and then a drop that's so big that someone's going to have to turn the stereo down? That's a problem. Is it consistent throughout the song in terms of loudness and tone? Is it also consistent with everything it's going to be listened with? So is it part of a film soundtrack? Is it part of an EP? Does it exist as part of an album? Is it consistent within that? So when we go from the first song to the second song, do we suddenly go, oh, wow, I'm in a different sonic world? We bring consistency there. So we want that album experience to be a consistent listening experience. Then there's wider consistency. Does it sit nicely with everything else released in that genre? So if you know you're going to be put in a YouTube playlist with a bunch of other Bollywood tunes, does it sit appropriately? Is it of the right volume level, loudness, tone to sit in that place? Because someone's going to put it in that place. You have control over it when you release it. Someone else is going to mix it up, put it in a DJ set, drop it in a Spotify playlist. It's going to turn up next to other tracks you've released 10 years ago. So do we have consistency? And then the final stage of consistency is it consistent with all of recorded music? Like, humans have been recording music since, the early 20th century. It's all out there. Do we suddenly have to buy a completely different stereo or turn everything up or down to listen to your track? That's a problem. It has to sit in there. So that's kind of the consistency part of what mastering is. That's one of the things that we aim to bring. And then, does it meet the technical standards and delivery? So that's my answer to what is mastering. And we're going to spend a lot of time on the audio greatness part today. Like, what's our process, manipulating the audio? But those are the fundamental tenets of what mastering is. I'm going to finish this section by just saying briefly what it's not. It's not another mixing stage. So the relative levels of everything that exists within a track, your guitars to your voice, your percussion elements, what the timbre of the reverb is, we change none of those things. The changes we're going to be talking about are subtle, and they affect the whole track. We're not going to be changing the elements within the track. Yeah.
Table analogy.
Oh, Donal loves this table analogy.
It's a great analogy. Check out this analogy, guys.
I've used it before. Right. If your track or your album, let's imagine you're a carpenter and you've made a piece of furniture. You've made a table. Okay. You've got together with like some skilled design people, carpenters. You've made a table. It's got your 4 legs. It's got your ornate decoration, right? That table, if that's your song, you bring it to a mastering engineer. The mastering engineer is not going to change that table. It's going to look exactly the same. It's going to feel exactly the same.
You're not going to make the legs any shorter.
No. But we are going to put maybe like a nice coat of French polish on it, and we're going to consider whether it works with the chairs that are going around it. Does it sit nicely within the room? Can we just put a flavor on it? It's still your table. It's never going to change being your table. Mastering should never completely change your track. It's the last level of lacquer.
Can we sand the table? I think we're allowed to sand the table.
I think we can sand off some edges.
Yeah.
But we're not allowed to fundamentally change the table. If we do that, we're being producers and mix engineers. That's not our job. That's not what we're here to do. Is that enough table?
Yeah.
Is everyone happy with the carpentry thing?
I'm happy with the table analogy. Thank you, Gethin.
So at this point, where should we go from here? Yeah, I'm gonna pass you over to Donal.
We'll talk about decisions and information, and then I'll talk about the room. Talk about the
We're just going to sit here and talk about what we're going to talk about, and then we'll tell you.
So Gethin talks a lot about decisions and decision-making, and we make decisions all the way through the audio process, from the composer to the arranger to the producer to the mixer to the mastering stage. There's a lot of musical and technical decisions go on. And Gethin talks a lot about the quality of your decisions depending on the information you get. So I'm going to pass you over to talk about that a little.
This bit, it's a really good point, whatever you're doing in music or sound technology. You can pretty much see our entire process as a series of decisions that we take over and over again. Should I do this thing? Should I not do this thing? Yes or no? And then you take another series of decisions. Decision-making is based on information, and that goes anywhere in our lives. Decision-making is based on information. If you can get hold of the best information you can, you're going to make better decisions. If you're navigating a new city, you've never been there before, if you can get yourself a really accurate map, then you're going to make good decisions about where you go. In audio, that map, that information, is your room and your monitoring. It's what you hear back. So not what you do, nothing you do that affects the audio. It's what you're hearing back from your monitors. That's the information that you make your judgments based on. And so we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort getting our room just right and our monitoring setup just right, because that will lead us to good decisions. So at this point, I'm going to ask Donal to speak a little bit about our room and what we've done and how we set up our space.
Okay, so yeah, in this particular part, I'll talk about our room. This isn't you should do this, but back one step, the goals and the aims of the room, to get the most accurate listening environment we could. That's something for you to consider when you set up your recording space, mixing space, mastering, with the specific aim of giving as good information as possible to help you make good decisions. And I might even stand up, because this isn't a conference presentation, this is a seminar.
Welcome to our studio.
This is our studio, 5,000 miles away in Wales. So the speakers we use, we ended up choosing 1970s speakers called IMF. They're transmission line speakers, the same principle as modern TDL? Yes, TDL speakers and PMC speakers. So they don't have huge cones, but they have a particular way of passing the low end through that means they're flat down to 19 hertz, which is pretty good. We've spent a lot of time on the acoustics of the room. There are, behind each of those panels, that's a false wall. There are bass traps in the back. On the sides, there's absorption. On the ceiling, you can't really see it, but it's broken up into lots of different levels. So that's a diffuser, that diffuses the sound. And the idea, and then driving the speakers, we've got they're passive speakers. It's a custom-built power amp that we had made. Obviously, I'm not saying you must build a custom power amp and have passive speakers, but choose your speakers carefully. Listen, if you're choosing a pair of speakers, listen to them loads before you buy them. Obviously, do read reviews, but don't believe the internet. Believe your ears. So go to the shop, listen to the speakers, take some music that you know, play stuff you know through the speakers, and choose speakers that you're comfortable with, that you feel you can sit with and work with for hours on end, tens of hours on end in our industry. Some of the extra stuff we've done in this room, we've paid a lot of attention to the mains electricity coming in. Everybody kind of knows this, but we forget it a lot. The better the quality of power that you give to any piece of audio equipment, the better it'll perform. So it's easy to just think, well, I'll just plug it in, any old cable, and it'll work. And it does, it works. But if you spend a little bit of time kind of going through, where's that power coming from? Is it clean? Is it abundant? Can we do anything to improve it? You actually can hear the difference. If you can somehow source better power, maybe a separate supply from the consumer unit, maybe or maybe some kind of power regulator or smoother, you will actually hear it in the music. You'll hear it when you're listening, but you'll also hear it if it's passing through any outboard gear. It'll sound better. For us, what we did, there's a power supply pole outside the studio with a transformer on it. So we asked the power company to come and drop a separate line in from the transformer into the studio. And that comes into the back, and it feeds just this stuff. So all the lights and the office and the computers and everything, they're all running on a spur from my house, which is 50 meters that way. So they don't matter. So everything audio is on a separate supply, and there's a really clean supply coming straight off the transformer. We ran all the power cabling, so from the power coming in, thick cable, well-screened cable with 6mm. All the cores are 6mm. So again, that's bringing that power as cleanly as possible. And then we also have chunky mains cables from the socket to the unit. So we just, all the way through, we've tried to allow as much power to come through. You don't have to go to such obsessive lengths as we have gone to, but it's just something to consider. You know, it will improve the quality of the sound. Mains. I think that covers it from a listening environment. That's the other thing. I called the whole thing. So if you think of everything together, the power amp, the speakers, the acoustic of the room, that's your listening environment. That's the environment you sit in and you do your listening. All those things affect it, but it's all there. And if you give it as much thought as possible and planned as well as possible, it just gives you better information to make better decisions.
Absolutely. The point is not do this. The point is give as much thought as you can to those things, and you'll make better decisions. I'll come back in and sit in front of the picture now. Yeah. So, as a sort of extra little bit to the good decisions point, specifically in mastering, it's true in all audio engineering, but specifically in mastering, I think about a concept that was outlined by a cycling coach called Dave Brailsford. He has this philosophy of marginal gains, which is if you can think of a very tiny improvement somewhere in your process, do it. So for him, it was, can we improve the aerodynamics of a bike helmet? Can we improve the rest of our cyclists? Can we get them 20 minutes more alone time in the middle of a 2-week race? If you can do even the smallest thing that's going to improve performance, do it, because it'll seem insignificant. But when you add all of the tiny, tiny improvements together, you can end up making a huge difference to the overall performance. And in mastering, a lot of the changes that we go on to talk about, the EQ that we're doing, the dynamic control that we're doing, they're going to be very subtle compared to what you might do in a mix. Very subtle changes. But a series of very subtle, very small changes can have a really big dramatic effect. And that's kind of the value that we bring in mastering.
What was the Japanese word we heard yesterday? Was it kanjan?
Kaizen?
There's a Japanese. The Japanese have a word for everything, but
there's a graphics card manufacturer named after it.
But yeah, there's a word for just that, where at every step of the way, you look for the small details and you improve the small details, and added together, it makes a big difference. So you can apply that to every area of your life, but yeah, and particularly with music and sound. So at this point, should we could get stuck into the weeds, get into the details. So to get into what we do when we master, we thought we'd just talk through the process of mastering, and we just tell you the things we do in the order that we do them, and in that way we'll cover everything we do. We'll go into as much detail as we can. I think we've got a lot of time.
Yeah.
If it gets boring, shout or go to sleep. So shall I talk first of all about setting up the session?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So a session obviously starts when a client gets in touch with us and we agree a rate and they send us a file. So before we can get into the studio, I strongly feel that the steps leading up to that are an important part of mastering. So talking to the client, establishing a relationship, making a human connection, so you feel like you know them a little bit, they feel they can trust you a little bit. And also, if you start building the trust, you know that if they have something they want to raise, they'll trust you to bring it up. So we can trust them to bring it up, and we can speak to them honestly about what's going on. So firstly, the human relationship before you even hear the song or step into the studio. And I think that applies across all areas of our industry. If you can strike up a good relationship with your client and help them feel they can trust you, then that's a great first step towards everything that you'll do together. And then the next step from that is to find out their expectations, to ask them, what are you expecting from this session? What's your song about? Where was it recorded? Tell us about the song. What do you want from us? Is there anything about your mix that you're not happy with? Is there anything in particular you want us to look at? Are there any references? So this is an important one. So are there any other songs in this genre or area that you've been listening to when you recorded it, or your music director has been listening to when he composed it? If so, send us those songs and we'll listen to them, and that'll put us in a place where we're getting into your headspace here. We know what you want to do. Also, a rough master is always useful to ask for. for us, because often people will mix and they'll send the song to the client, but because the client doesn't want to hear a quiet song, they'll quickly put it through a mix bus processor to bring the level up, maybe do some a quick preset mastering thing, send it to the client, and the client listens to it, loves it, great, that's signed off. Of course, you need to take that off before you send it to mastering, otherwise it'll restrict what we can do. But then if you take it off and the song changes and we don't know what the client signed off on, we need to know what the client loves already, because that's the benchmark for us to work to. So we always ask, do you have a reference master that you've all been listening to? And often they say, oh yes, we do, but we don't want to send you that because we want you to bring your thing to it. And we go, yes, that's fine, we will. But we also need to listen to what you've been listening to. Because every now and again, we get a mix and the reference master is like 10 miles away. It's completely different. There was so much processing put on to send, well, maybe even during the mixing, oh, this isn't my mix bus kind of chain, and they mix the song and they make all these decisions with that on and send to the client, it gets signed off. And then everybody's been told, like, if you're sending it to mastering, turn off the mix bus processor. So they turn off all these 6 processes and the mix changes completely. And we've got many steps to go to even get to where they started. So, but if we can find this out before we start working, saves a lot of time. And even that process of going back and forth builds trust, builds communication, builds the human connection. And then, so the next step, so that's the communication part. Then we'll step into the studio and have a listen to the mix, have a listen to the song, get a feel for what the song wants. And there's a step here, which we call mix feedback or a mix check, where we can take a listen through. If the song's urgent, they need it back in 3 hours, we can't do this. But generally, if there's a bit more time, we can have a listen to the song, check everything feels okay, check everything's hitting okay. Is there anything about this mix that might give us some trouble when we're mastering? Like, is the kick drum and the bass drum, the kick drum and the bass, are they maybe out of balance, or is anything sticking out or too far back? And at that point, we can, again, because we're building a relationship and the communication lines are open, we can then get back in touch with our client and say, this sounds great. Was that thing intentional? That thing in the low end, was that intentional? And they might say, yes, that's exactly what we want. To say, great, we can run with that. Or, oh, thanks for pointing that out. I was mixing in a small room. I couldn't quite tell. And then we can say, okay, cool, we'll work on another project, you tweak the mix and send us it back. So at that point, we'll get a mix that both of us are happy with. And we've got all this background information and we've got to know everybody. So that all of that has happened before I've even plugged the mix into anything and made any changes at all. So that I consider all of that to be part of the mastering process. And then we'll sit down. That kind of covers that. Shall I pass it over to you, sitting down to start the mastering session?
Yeah, it's probably quite a nice place to hand over.
Yeah. So yeah, I've done all that. But actually, quite often, this is how our work is delineated in our business. Because I generally sit at the desk and do all the communications and the business and the quotes and the invoices and stuff, and then I pass it over to GETHIN, who's usually sitting there, and say, over to you. So we'll do that here as well. Over to you, mate.
Lovely stuff. Thank you. The thing, just to summarize one aspect of what Donald's talking about there, all of that trust building, it's really important to respect whoever came before you, the mix engineer, the recording engineer, the composer. We as mastering engineers always sit towards the end of the chain. We're usually the last sound engineer. So you have to respect what everyone else has done before. And so that whole mix check process, it's really important that you approach it not in a, oh God, look at this awful thing the client has done, and more in a, oh, okay, interesting. What have you done there? Yeah, I like that a lot. But at this point, we're moving forward. We're in the session. Donald's talked a lot about the studio. So we've got our monitoring room set up. We've got the track. Everyone's happy with the mix. I've got a reference. So I'll set up my DAW, usually with very few tracks. I mean, we're mastering our typical DAW session has simply got 3 channels on it, 3 stereo channels, because we only work in stereo. I'll have a track at the bottom, which is the unaffected mix, exactly as it came in. A track at the top, which is where my final print is going to go, where a final track is. And on that track is usually the reference that we were just talking about. Also, in the project, I might have 3 or 4 other songs if the client has sent some reference material, like, oh, they're aiming for this kind of thing. So I can very quickly jump at the same level on the same monitoring system without switching software to either the reference that the director has heard or other tracks in that genre. And there's another thing that we thought it really important to mention here. I won't go into every plugin that might or might not turn up, but there's one I want to mention at this point in time. We set up our system in such a way that we can bypass any process, whether that's one of our analog units or whether that's one plugin or a series of plugins, and it have no effect on the perceived loudness. Because one of the big things we're going to do in mastering is probably push that loudness up quite a lot from the mix to where the master is. If I'm constantly A-Bing between something that's 6 dB quieter and 6 dB louder, I'm going to make bad decisions, because the one that's 6 dB louder is always going to sound better.
Louder always sounds better.
Yeah.
And just before we carry on, I often qualify this point by saying if you take any one point out of everything we say today, if you take away any one thing, let it be this, that if you change something and you're comparing before and after that thing, compare it at the same perceived level. Because even half a dB, if you're listening to before or after, even half a dB different, you might not be able to hear the level, but you'll hear a difference in character, and you'll start making decisions on incomplete information. So that, if you're writing things down, write that one down. So, yeah.
Sorry, what was that? Do we have levels set?
Like, do you have a particular listening volume or level set in the room? Like,
so we don't.
Okay.
We will quite happily listen up and down the volume level. Some mastering engineers do. Okay. It's one of the reasons why Donal caveated this speech at the beginning with, this isn't a how-to. This isn't like you must do this thing. Bob Katz actually has a whole section on consistent monitoring and a system of loudness. Well worth reading his book and well worth taking those concepts on board. We don't fix our levels. We do have a rotary controller. We do have monitoring gain. But
I have a volume that I'm really comfortable at.
Yeah.
That I usually end up back. It's not too quiet, not too loud. It's that I'm comfortable working at. That I always kind of revert to, and then maybe when I'm doing some detailed EQ or listen out for a particular thing, I'll just turn it up just while I kind of find and focus on that thing, and then I'll turn it back down to my comfortable level again. And then the other way, I might, if I'm listening to a number of tracks together to try and get a feel for how does this track next to this track sit next to that one, how do these 5 tracks feel next to each other, I might actually turn the volume down quite low for that, because low volume is a good way of picking out, is the vocal in the right place, it's a different listening experience when it's quiet. Yeah. And then I'll go back up to my comfortable listening one. So there's a place I usually end up, but it's kind of instinctive rather than deliberate.
I tend to use that myself as a little fail-safe. If I've been mastering for a couple of hours and I find myself a long way away from where I know I usually end up at my comfortable zone, it's worth checking that I've done everything right, because I've ended up somewhere else. But no, to answer your original question, we don't fix our monitoring level, but those are our thoughts.
Thank you.
So we've covered switching in and out. When you're doing those blind A/B tests, really important to be at the same perceptual level. So now we've got our door up. That first channel is going to go out. we're probably going to do some, yeah.
So the first thing to do at this point is to sit back and kind of feel the song, hear the song, and decide what to do. So we talked about decision making, and so we kind of set the level, we're comfortable, sit back and listen. What does this song need? Is there anything in this mix that's getting between me and the song? Is there anything? So what is the songwriter, what are the music director, what are the musicians trying to convey emotionally? Is this, music is an emotional thing. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But so what are the musicians trying to convey? And put myself in the shoes of the listener, of the music fan who's just bought or downloaded or streamed this song. What do they want to hear? And that question kind of naturally leads into, actually, I want to look at the low end here. The low end maybe could be tightened up, or the high end's too bright, or there's some stuff in the mids. So the first part of the process is listening as a human, as a musician, as a music fan. And that kind of draws you into what specific thing am I going to change next.
Yeah.
So
that's a really important first step. And so once you've kind of done that and you've thought about what you might want to look at, the first practical thing we usually do, so I've got that mix there, I'm probably going to set a level and set a signal path. At this point, every piece of gear adds color. So the way that you get through your system matters. And so the very first thing, well, it's not the very first thing. At this point, we're actually mid-mastering. But we're setting our level so that we sit next to those references, next to those shoot mixes, if that's what the director's been listening to. We get ourselves in the ballpark of where the client wants the master to be. We'll do that by adjusting gain stages. For us, we'll choose a D to A to come out of. We have two set up. Every piece of equipment imparts color. So we're going to listen, go, oh, that one suits this song nicely. This path, with none of the EQs doing anything and with none of the limiters doing anything, apart from adding a little bit of gain, okay, that gets us through our system in a really nice way. We're roughly in the ballpark of where we want to be. That's probably the first thing. I'd call that range finding. You're sort of finding the range of where you want the master to be eventually. Once you've got that, then we probably move into EQ at this stage. For mastering, I've sort of got this broken down into three parts. Firstly, think about corrective, tiny, surgical EQ, usually subtractive, usually with very small bands. So if in this listening process we're thinking, actually there's something in the low mids that really needs some attention, we're going to get quite surgical about that. We might use some analyzers. We're going to listen.
And this will all be in the digital domain. So when you're doing details, this analog gear, you can't focus in on a note with the outboard gear. So for the detail, the fine detail, that's always you're pulling up plugins. You're reaching for the algorithms because you can do so much. There's so much power in the digital stuff if you use it judiciously. And so I just had that in. Carry on.
It's good. It's a good point.
We're going to interrupt each other a lot today.
I'm imagining like my cursor on the screen, and that's where I'm at the moment. I'm in the digital world. So focused in on an individual frequency, making some very small cuts, maybe exactly on resonances that are what's getting in my way of feeling this track. And so we'll do some small surgical work. That's usually the first thing that we'll do. The second category of EQ that I like to think of is the broader shaping EQ. So something like, I don't know if I'm sure you've all heard of Baxendall shelves. It's a particular type of shelving EQ. We have one here. We have the dangerous version of it in the analog domain. That's kind of, does the whole thing need to tilt upwards or downwards? Do we need loads less bottom end, loads more top end? Are we a long way away from where we need to be? Do we need shelves in any way? And then shaping EQ, these two tend to be in the analog domain pretty much. The digital tools are really, really good, unbeatable at surgical, high Q cuts, fixing tiny little issues. If you're shaping the whole tone of a track, the analog EQs broadly win, certainly if you're boosting. And so those are the two types of EQ, and I'll probably focus on a bit of the surgical stuff first. Sit back, bit of the tone shaping, all the time switching. Well,
yeah. The analogy I use with the broad and the fine detail is a painting analogy with the overall sound and feel and shape. I call it broad brush strokes. It's where you take a big brush and you just paint the general picture. You get the overall color and the overall feel. And then for the detail, for the digital tools, that's the fine brush. You pick the fine brush and you're going and you're doing tiny details like that. So I sometimes think of it as a painting analogy. So the broad brush strokes we tend to do in the analog domain. And maybe when you're starting out, maybe you won't have outboard gear. Maybe you might find yourself just in the digital domain. But that doesn't mean you can't. You can still take the same approach. You can kind of sit back and think about the bigger picture, and then sit forward a bit and think about the detail. So if you kind of think about different perspectives to look at it, it doesn't necessarily have to be an analog and digital split. But yeah, if you can think of it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way to break up your EQ thoughts. And then at this point, that's pretty much what we do. But at that point, you iterate that process. So maybe you've done some corrective EQ, and then you sit back. Do I like it? Do I not like it? Do I like it? Do I not like it? It's in, it's out. Again, we're A-Bing at the same perceived loudness level. Same with the broad shaping EQ. When it's in, do I like it? When it's out, do I like it? If there's something that still needs to be changed, you just go around that path again. Okay, I didn't get it quite right. It doesn't give me the vibe. You know, let's go around that process again. And that's actually kind of the process.
There's one important thing to remember about EQing, when you're EQing. So we work on the final mix. We've got a stereo mix, or we might have had some stems, but we've summed them together before we hit most of the processing. So when you're EQing and mastering, everything you do affects everything else. Yeah. So, the vocal's a little bit, there's a bit of an edge in the vocal. Okay, so I'm going to go and EQ the vocal. That EQ is affecting the vocal, it's affecting the guitars, it's affecting the pads, the keyboards, it's affecting the snare drum. So you very much, I kind of feel like I'm tiptoeing through a track when I'm EQing it. Okay, I'm going to do something that quite carefully. And so that's just something to be really aware of. And actually, you were talking about the iterative process. I often find myself, I go through, okay, I'm going to change that, I'm happy with that, great. I'm going to change that, great, I'm happy with that. And I go through 5, 6, 7, whatever, however many things, and then I sit back. And then A-B the whole track, the whole song, and I'm going, okay, how am I, okay, actually, that second thing I did, I'm going to back it off a bit. Yeah, great. A, B, okay, that fifth thing I did, actually, I'm going to turn that off completely. And I often go through and do a bunch of things, and then step half of them back, because I've gone a bit too far when I'm focusing on one thing, and actually the sweet spot is somewhere in between. But yeah, always being mindful of things that are changing that I didn't intend to change, because all I've got is the stereo mix to play with.
At this point, it's worth remembering the Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath that doctors take, which is first, do no harm. Whatever you're doing, you're working on a track, first, don't make it worse, while trying to fix something else.
Can I swear? Because the Donal's version of the Hippocratic Oath, Donal's first rule of mastering is don't fuck it up. Don't make it worse.
Same thing in...
the Hippocratic Oath is a far more respectful way of saying that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose at that point, that's sort of our process for one track. We're probably going to come back to elements of that. But there's another whole part of mastering, which is the multi-track master, when we talked about consistency earlier on. And I might ask you to talk about this. The other big part of mastering is sequencing and putting tracks together. Do you have some thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, so that iterative process of getting to where you're comfortable with. Actually, just before we move on to the last song, to the next song, so let's just picture I'm in an album mastering session. I've got 8 songs to master, and it's the morning, and I've had some tea, and I'm settling in. And that first song I've spent a while on. Just before I move on to the second one, one of the keys is knowing when to stop, is knowing when I'm satisfied, knowing when the work is done here. And that tends to be an instinctive thing, because you're iterating, you can keep going, and if you want, you can keep going and keep going and keep going. And there's it's more of a feel thing, an instinct thing. And what we're doing in iterating, I think of it as sitting forwards and sitting back a lot, which maybe I physically do that. Sitting back and listening to the song as a human with your heart, feeling that emotional content that the song is trying to convey. And then getting into the head and moving forwards and doing technical stuff and sitting back, and there comes a point when it's almost just a feeling. I'm like, I sit back and I've been in a kind of inquisitive and curious, and I sit back and there's almost a kind of a wave of yeah, that's it. That feels good. I turn it up. That's feeling nice to me. I turn it down. That's feeling I could maybe go and work on some more detail there, but actually no, overall this is giving me the feeling I wanted to get when I first sat down and I listened to the song, and there was just a few things in between me and that feeling, and the feeling's there, great, so I'm going to print it. That doesn't have to be final, but I'm going to print it now because I've got that feeling. I think that could be my version 1. And maybe I'll come back to that, especially if it's an album and I then move on and I work on another 6, 7 or 8 songs, and by the time I've got to the end of the album and got to know the album and the sound and the feel and the band and what's being conveyed, I might actually come back to that first track and look at it again. But I'll just draw a line and say, yep, I'm happy there, and move on, just to keep the flow going and to keep the energy going. So yeah, that's what I'll do at the conclusion of the first song. And then we'll print it. And in this scenario, it prints in real time because there's output gear. You can't do a fast run through with the output gear. You've got to run it in real time. And that's also an opportunity to hit play, and you kind of hit save and take the picture of the settings. But actually to sit back and listen to the song from the start to the end, with not focusing, just listen to it as a song, maybe get up, maybe walk around, maybe go make another cup of tea, and just listen to the song. And like, yeah, okay, that feels good. And I feel like I've got to know, and I feel I've got it to a place I'm happy with.
Just at that point, that's often a moment where I'll realize something. When I've been zoomed in, and you hit print on your version 1, and you think, oh, I haven't paid attention to that first verse in the last 20 minutes because I've been focusing on the crescendo at the end. So that real-time playthrough is absolutely crucial to the process. I mean, it's technically necessary because we've got analog gear, but even if you're in the digital domain, it's well worth doing. Just once in a while, stop and play the whole track from the start to the end.
At a different volume to you, maybe turn it down a bit, or turn it up a bit, or whatever. Just listen to the whole song. Because GETHIN talks about, what do you call it? We serve the song. That's one of your something you feel strongly about. We are there, and so is the mix engineer, and so is the music producer, and so is the arranger, and so the musicians playing on it. We're all there. The song is what the songwriter wants to convey to their audience. And we're all here to serve the song. In fact, everything in this hall, everything in this expo, all the equipment, all the businesses, all the people, we're all there to serve the song, to serve that emotional connection between the songwriter and the audience and the music listener. So yeah, play it through. We're digressing a lot here. I hope you don't mind as we remember stuff. So okay, we've done the first song. It's printed. It's up. I've reset the EQs and the compressors and the limiter, bypassed everything. So the new song is coming through. It's probably going to come through the same signal path. So those decisions we made at the beginning, which converters are we going to use, which EQs are we going to go through, which plugins are we going to pull up, chances are we're going to leave most of those in place, because one of the things we're aiming with here, with an album, let's say this 8-track album we're talking about, is to get a consistency across that sound. So they may have been recorded at different places, mixed at different times, maybe mixed in different spaces. So it's our job to try and pull those together a little bit. And one of the things that can pull those together is a consistent signal path. So I'll pull up the second song, and I'll listen to it through. Like we said, listen to the whole thing once, get the feel of the song. And then before I do anything, I'll jump back to the first song. Say, oh yeah, that's how I made that sound. Jump to the second song, jump back and forth. Okay, so I'm hearing some differences here. And I can kind of feel, okay, this is where I want to go with the second song. So I'm listening to the second song in and of itself, but I'm also listening to the second song in context with the first song. And when I'm working on the third song, I'll be jumping back to the second and the first song and getting a feel. And when I'm listening to the eighth song, I'll be jumping back 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or that's the upbeat song. I know tracks 4 and 2 matching that one, so I'm kind of picking parts in the album that are relevant to the bit I'm working on now, is to give me more information, back to what GETHIN was saying about information to make decisions with. So I'm working on the second song, and I'll start EQing that and start focusing in on some details and focusing out and doing some broad brush strokes, and then comparing back to the first one. And at this point, I always sometimes have to remind myself it's really important that I don't want to make them all sound the same. You can't make all the songs in an album sound the same, because each song is different. It's in a different key, it's a different speed, it's a different vibe. It's probably got a different arrangement, might even have different instruments. So if you try and force the second song to sound the same as the first song, you're going to disrespect the second song, and you might well do stuff that doesn't suit that. And the listener doesn't want that anyway. The listener wants to be able to listen through to the whole thing and enjoy it without turning it up or down. That's all the listener wants. Yeah. So I think of it as I want to put the second song in the same space, in the same audio, same oral musical space as the first one, so that when one ends, there's a bit of a gap, and the next one comes in, it feels like it comes in the right place. And it might be a brighter song, it might be a faster song, it might be a harder song, or a heavier song in the low end, but as long as it feels like it belongs to the first one. So it doesn't have to be the same, but it has to feel like it belongs. So that's a line to walk, is to make the second song sound good in and of itself and feel like it belongs to the first song, but not the same.
Yeah, on that point, I wrote down earlier today when we were talking about this, I wrote down vibe matching.
Oh, yeah, nice.
It's a bit like that. It's of the same project, but not the same project. Earlier on, I talked about consistency. We're looking for consistency. We're not looking for identicalness.
That's great. So, and again, so one of the things I'm matching as well as the tonal shape and the vibe is the level. So I spend quite a lot of time thinking about the volume between different songs. And again, it doesn't want to be the same. So a quieter song in an album probably wants to sit back a little bit. It wants to be a little bit quieter than the song before it. In a Western songwriting sense, if you've got a full band and then there's the ballad with just acoustic guitar and voice, that has to sit back a little bit, else when you play it, it kind of jumps out. Because a guitar and a vocal is quieter than a full band, so you need to sit it back. So it's and that kind of builds up as well over the album. And then let's say the example, I'm working on track 6 and I'm jumping back to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Actually, every time I jump back to track 3, that sounds a little bit quiet now. So I might go back a bit later. I'm going to bump that up half a dB just to get. And then as the more I work, I'm kind of getting the overall shape. The overall shape of this feels good now. Like, or maybe track 5, I'll come back and soften the top end. So you can kind of go back as you go, and then so then that's as you go. I'll kind of pause there for a sec. So the next step after that, I'm not going to dive straight into it, just because we're just two guys talking. We've got to leave gaps.
Yeah.
We're going to talk, do you want to talk about the compilation then? About the gaps and the tops and tails?
Yeah, we can talk about compilation. So all of this is happening in the same DAW session with the same signal chain. And now, by this point, we're starting to get prints of every single track in the project. So that top line I described earlier on, it hasn't got reference tracks in it anymore. It's got the whole of the album, tracks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At this point, one of the really important things when constructing an album is how the songs flow into one another.
Actually, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, because we've almost glossed over the part. There's a part where you've just finished, you've been working all day, and you've EQ'd the 8th song, and you've run it through, and you're happy, and you've jumped around, and you kind of, you press hit, and you just get up, and you kind of stretch. Great, that's that part of the work done. And I usually go make myself a cup of tea at that point. And it really does feel like that's the end of one part of the process. And I've done that, and that's the detailed work. I've spent hours and hours working in on the detail.
I'm actually going to stand up as
You're
well.
going to stand up as well. This really is how it goes. So at that point, we're going to sit back down, and I'm going to compile it. And it's a completely different job. So I've done all the... It's almost like the EQ and stuff. It's almost technical stuff and to do with frequencies. And then compiling it's a bit more of like... I'm a listener. I'm just going to sit back and listen to this album. So it's kind of... You almost focus... kind of zoom right back out. You go, okay, this is the album. I'm happy with how it sounds. I'm just going to look at how it flows. And that's kind of editing and fades and timing and stuff. So it's just a completely different job. That's why I just wanted to make a break and stand up and convey that. And it's a different headspace. So yeah, carry on with what you're going to do now. We've had a cup of tea.
Well, it's something you're not going to do every project, because quite often you're dealing with a single project. But the flow of track to track is really important, and especially when compiling soundtracks or albums, they're going to be played in a sequence. And our process for that is to sit and listen, maybe roughly put the second track, maybe...
Top and tail it first.
Oh, we haven't topped and tailed?
Yeah, you've got to top and tail it.
Okay. Another big part of the mastering engineer's job, when you hit play on the streaming service, or when you hit play on the CD or skip, it needs to come in right on the money. So your mixes have probably got a tail at the beginning where the reverb dumps and there's a little bit of room noise or whatever, and at the end there's a reverb tail and something will fade out. The master has to be very carefully cut. We currently use just over an 1/8 of a second as our gap at the beginning of a song. So you hit play, 125 milliseconds is what our system's
But you
currently
actually
set to.
you trim right up to the first note. You zoom right in so you can see it, maybe boost the waveform, and you kind of put that there and you hit play. Yes, that's right. That's a comfortable start. So you trim the silence to there, and then we move the marker back a little bit. We call it an 1/8 it doesn't have to be an 1/8 of a second, just so there's just a tiny, because if you we did it originally with CDs, because in part of the CD spec is you have to have a 1/6 of a second. You have to start the CD track 1/6 of a second before the music, because some older CD players might take that amount of time to catch up with the error correction and start playing. Yeah. But actually, even in the digital world, that ever such a slight gap, just it feels better. If it kind of it almost makes you jump if you press the button and it starts. So. So that we've ended up doing it, and other mastering houses do as well. It just, for some inexplicable reason, it just seems to work. That is a fraction of a second, but it does make a difference.
And technically speaking, in the modern age, that equivalent of that CD format is that usually there's some sort of gate on your phone's D2A or your computer's D2A, and that needs to wake up and just start. It needs a few samples just to go, oh, I'm about to produce music. So it doesn't wake up through the first transient. So once we've trimmed the very beginning of every song, the counterpoint to that that's really important is the tail at the end of each song. So the last note hits, and then the reverb tail, or the natural sound of the room, or whatever the last sustained string note is, whatever that very last sound is, there are ways you can end nicely. There are fade-outs that are nice. You might like I quite like for a fade-out a kind of slight S shape just on the end, or no fade whatsoever and let a short reverb die to its entire, T60 end time. Very often you'll have little artifacts of digital noise, so you've got to consider how you come out of that and back to true silence. That's very much a feel thing. We'll spend quite a bit of time on that.
I'll also add in here that sometimes in mastering, everything's mixed together and you put a fade on. But actually, when you're mixing, that's something you can spend a bit of time on. Because in mastering, there might be one delay going longer and one reverb ending more quickly, you can actually spend a little bit of time in your mix just crafting the decay of the last note. So giving some time and thought to after the last note is played and how that ends. Because if you can match, the classic is bass players. Bass players, like they play the last note and they let it ring. They go boom, and then they go whoop, and they kind of put their hand on. So you've got the mix. You can, and if everything else is kind of tailing off very nicely there, and you've got this, bass player's note kind of ringing through it. So you've got the power in the mix to actually work those individually and kind of match them to each other. So you can craft a nicer end to after the last note in the mix than we can in mastering. And we always appreciate it when we're doing that tail in mastering, kind of, oh, that's great, that's great, that's been set up nice, I can leave that and just maybe chase the fade at the very end to go to silence.
It's actually more important than you think, because it's the last emotion you leave the person with. It's as they walk away from the song. We kind of all think of it as an afterthought, but it's the very last thing the listener hears and feels is the end, that moment where they close their eyes and relax and wait for the next thing. So well worth spending time on. Automate your delays down. Make sure that if you've got any compressors that are adding analog noise, that they disappear before the end, or just that the whole thing ends in a way that's really nice.
Yeah, fade the noise quickly. Sorry, have got a question here? Oh, so fading them into each other. Uh-huh. Very rarely, to be honest. It's really tempting. So the question is, do we bring in the next song, kind of on the beat on the beat of the bar of the song before? And while it's tempting, for me, I often so the way I set I'll go into setting the gap then. Yeah. So the way we set the gap is to play at least 30 seconds of the outgoing song, and let it play out and let it finish, and take a breath, and set the marker for the next one. It's kind of the breath is a good tool to use, because you listen to something and you're holding the song in a particular way and you're listening, and then it ends, and at the point where you relax and your expectation comes in for the next one, it kind of the breath often should I tell you the
go for it.
When I was young in my 20s, I worked in a studio in London. An American producer was in, and he said the perfect time for the next song to come in is if you take a blast on a joint, and when you breathe out, that's when it's got to come in. So I loved that because I was young and I used to smoke a lot of weed, but now I don't, and I do yoga and breathing, and actually the breath is actually what he meant, or what we can take from that is actually the breath. What he meant, he was holding that while he was passing the tension and kind of releasing the last song, and then when he breathed out. So that's kind of, you can do it, you don't need smoke for that, you can do it with your breath, because it's about the breath and the body and how you feel. So that's it's a good story, but don't smoke weed just to get the gaps right in your album. It's not good advice.
The one thing I would add, because it's a really good question, there is a natural rhythm that will still be in you when that last 30 seconds of that track plays. And you will sort of, it might be slowing down or it might be exactly on the beat. There will be a natural point where you feel, oh yeah. Or, so Donal's right in that you take a breath and you stop thinking of that tempo. But if you interrupt that natural tempo, if you get it completely wrong, it will just feel wrong to you when you put it there, because it'll feel like someone's just shocked you when the next song starts to come in.
And you do, and you put it there at that point, and then you jump back the same 30 or 40 seconds and you play it and you listen to it. Kind of sit back, forget you've set it, you don't look at the screen. I always zoom right out. So I've set the thing and I've done the edit, and I zoom right out to the whole album, so I can't see where it's going to come in, because if I can see the edit and I can see the line going, I'm expecting it, and that's changed how I'm listening to it. So I zoom right out and I hit play. And the reason I say 30 or 40 seconds, this is what I was taught back in the 90s in London. If you just listen to the last 10 seconds and you set it and the gap feels right, when you listen to the whole song, the gap's too short, because you haven't put yourself in the space of listening to the whole song. 30 or 40 seconds is enough to get you into the space of I'm listening to the song, I'm in the vibe of the song, I'm in the song, I'm feeling it, and then it comes. And sometimes it is bang on, and sometimes you count it and you try it, and you go, okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and you put it there, and you listen back that 30 or 40 seconds, and the gap, it counts, but it feels too long. I want the song to come in sooner. So every now and again, it really works, and you come in on the beat, and it's perfect. But more often than not, it's the breath thing. And then my final point on that is, in the old days of CDs, we used to put a track end mark and a track start mark, and that would go on the metadata of the CD, and you'd see it counting down on the display. I don't know if you guys even have CD players anymore. But what we found we send tracks out for streaming and for digital distribution, is we don't even put a mark at the end. We put the mark, we leave the silence, and we put the track end mark where the next track comes in, or a sixth of a second before the next track comes in, so that the gap that felt right before the next track comes in goes around the internet with the song. And if it gets put in a playlist, and then there's a gap in that point where the next track wants to come in, maybe a Shakira track comes in, or Jomi Jo Patan comes in, or something like completely different comes in, but at least it's had that breath to kind of settle. And kind of, I think of that gap as respect for the song that's just gone before. That gap is like, great, that song's ended.
And luckily for us, that gap, the emotional connection to the gap is with the song that's gone before, what's just gone before. So actually, you'll find that if you add that 1 second or whatever you end up deciding it to be, 1.5 of silence, it'll feel right even if something completely different comes in. So spend some time getting that right. Don't necessarily chop it off and end your track there.
And I'm going to pass this back to you, Gethin, to talk about the practicals. The thing's finished now. I might get up and make another cup of tea. The thing's finished, all the gaps are set. So then it just needs to be exported and delivered. So this part's called delivery. So all the work's done, all the creative work is now done. We made all the creative decisions, it's finished, the project, you hit save, it's done. So then you need to deliver the master. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we'll sort of move through this quickly, but there are a few important things to hang on to. The main one, really, if you were going to note down one thing, is know where your track is going to go. Where is this going to be listened to? Because if it's going to be listened to on digital platforms, it's going to go through, when it leaves your hands, it's going to go through some lossy conversion. It's probably going to go through an AAC converter or something similar. If it's going to YouTube, it's going to be contained within maybe an MP4 file. You might not necessarily have control. Try and find out where your file is going to be listened to, and then try as much as you can to listen to it in that format as well, just as a final check, to check if that's going to work nicely for you. So you kind of need to be aware of that. So where is this track going? 90% of the time at this point, it's going to go for digital distribution. That's how people listen to music these days. So what we always say is the sample rate that the project was mixed at, and then we match that in the master, and 24-bit files. So quite often you'll end up with a 48 kilohertz, 24-bit WAV file. That will be exactly the right start and end point. That's usually what you're delivering to the client. They will often also ask for a 44.116, because historically, 44.1 kilohertz, 16-bit is CD digital audio. And when things started moving to the internet, people took the digital files from CDs and distributed those. And so some distributors still require 44.116s. Have a listen to your converters. But
don't send MP3s or AACs. Don't try and preempt that distribution process, because every distributor will take in the file and then they will convert it to the format that every distributor needs. So if you've already converted it, that's two conversions and it'll sound worse. So give the distributor the highest quality file that they will accept, the highest resolution that they will accept, and then trust them that will then get converted along the line and get distributed correctly. That's where you just give them the best you've got, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, 32-bit float is great, and we'll start delivering 32-bit float files when everyone accepts them. Basically, Donal's point stands there, which is give the distributor the highest resolution file that they are happy to work with, doing as few conversions as you possibly can. And when you do them yourself with high-quality converters, but don't change it to preempt what's going to happen afterwards. If you've operated throughout with 32-bit float files, that's absolutely fine to pass on if you know that the next person is happy to receive that. As a rule, I wouldn't start distributing those files willy-nilly because most people don't yet accept that as a final delivery format.
And you can't trust those people not to truncate it. If you're at 32 bits and you want to get to 24 bits,
you need
take
to dither.
responsibility for dithering it, because if you dither it from 32 to 24, or even from 24 to 16, it'll sound better. If you send it out to some person who doesn't know or care, they might just say, they might just copy a file and it might truncate it. And if you truncate from 24 to 16 or from 32 to 24, that introduces distortions and artifacts that are so I personally, I would always dither it. If I'm at 32, I'd dither it to 24 so that I'm in control of that process, and I know that some idiot further down the line won't mess it up.
It's about, going back to the start of this little section on distribution, it's about knowing where your file is going to go as well as you can and future-proofing it as much as possible. So, yeah, we could have a whole other session on dither and noise shaping, but basically deliver the highest resolution file that your distributor or your label will accept from you, and then worry about the platforms down the line.
So the one other thing to cover on delivery is dynamic range. So hopefully we're reaching past the point where everybody wants everything to be delivered as loud as possible, and as loud as possible is really, 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 really loud. So there are still some people who need their masters delivered really, 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 really loud. More people are asking for it to be back a bit, because even those couple of dBs back from the very edge where we got to, there's some great gains to be had there. That's part of the communication process with the client. Sometimes you'll have a client who wants more dynamic range, but their client needs it to be extremely loud, at which point you can have that discussion. And because we've built trust doing all the things we spoke about earlier, you can have that discussion openly and honestly, and nobody's trying to kind of get around anybody. The other consideration with volume is more and more streaming platforms have algorithms that adjust the playback volume so that everything plays back on that platform at the same level. Apple Music and Spotify have a switch now. They have a selection. You can toggle it on and off. YouTube doesn't even have a switch. YouTube, for years, they were the first to take this step. And actually, I applaud them for it. I don't applaud Google for much, but I applaud them for this. And so the song you send to YouTube, you upload to YouTube, will be, if it's loud, it'll get turned down. So if we know that's going to happen, it's a really easy step to do, is to go back one step with your mastering. Well, actually, the first thing to do is use something. There's a website called loudnesspenalty.com, which I highly recommend. There's plenty of other tools where it can tell you what different platforms will stream this as. And you run it through that. I just open loudnesspenalty.com, drag the file in, and I look particularly for the YouTube one, and it says, okay, YouTube will turn this track down 4.5 dBs. So I'll go, okay, I'll go back to my project, I'll open it, and I'll set the whole thing back 4.5 dBs. And the final limiter will limit the track 4.5 dBs less. So suddenly there's a lot more dynamic, and there's a few more transient, there's a bit more air, and the whole track breathes a little bit more. And then we bounce that and call it the YouTube version, like have the word YouTube in the file name, and deliver that to the client, and then they put that to the video and upload it to YouTube. And at that point, YouTube, the algorithm reads it and says, well, I don't need to turn that down at all, because And the difference in sound between the loud master that's turned down 4.5 dBs and the 4.5 dBs quieter master that hasn't been turned down, that's a nice difference. With the caveat being, if there was a particular sound and a tightness about the sound that was really cooking at that higher level, you maybe only want to turn it down 1 or 2, and every now and again that's perfect as it was, let it be turned down, because that's doing everything. But it's just something that's definitely worth considering. So think about the platform it's going to, and if they're going to turn it down, consider turning it down for them, but before your final limiter, so it gets squashed less.
Yeah, be wary here, because there's nothing that says they're not going to change that policy at some point in the future. And the thing that I would say be especially wary of is having multiple versions of a track out there with different dynamic range means you've got different amounts of punch, means you've got different feel. So yes, and we do exactly what Donald's just described, but be very wary about those files, where those files end up. And I don't like going too far. I sometimes won't go the full range because there is a tightness, there is an aggression that you and whoever signed off that master liked. So don't ever just do it, bounce it, forget it, send it off. That's sort of a general principle anyway. Listen,
there's an
listen to everything.
There's an example, one of GETHIN's biggest ever hits, Jo Mijo Patan from the movie Patan. You didn't do a YouTube version of that. The version that's on YouTube that's had 1 billion views is really loud, and it's been turned down 5 or 6 dBs by the YouTube algorithm. So
had a conversation. Had a conversation with Abhishek Khandelwal, who mixed it, and he said, "No, let's keep it exactly the same." So there was a file that went back that said YouTube version, but we didn't make any additional dynamic range to it whatsoever because it wanted to have exactly that feel that the master had. And so let the platforms do what they will sometimes. If you've got something sounding absolutely cooking, let them do their conversions, let them do their volume shifts. It's a good thing for the future of music, but if it's not a great thing for that particular track, that's okay.
Okay, we'll call that an option then. You have the option to put more dynamic range in before you deliver. But again, you can make creative decisions. So that kind of brings us to the end of the mastering process. We've still got some time together, so we're going to cover another. I was going to suggest maybe, we've been sat here, does everybody want to stand up? Or maybe have a bit of a stretch.
Stand up again.
And kind of turn around, say hello to your neighbour. I'm going to drink some water.
You should all feel free to have a stand up and a stretch. We've made you sit down for an hour at this point. Hour and a quarter.
There was a kettle over here. I'd go and make a cup of tea. So we had two more subjects we wanted to cover. So what was yeah, we'll do.
Because we said that we've already done.
Yeah, we have. Quarter to talk about
Mastering with heart. Yeah. I think what we're going to just finish the main talking section. I mean, us talking to you section about is a subject we've been talking about a lot recently, which is mastering with heart. And then we're going to open it up to questions for a whole chunk of time. So I'm going to pass over to Donald because you'll notice all the way through this talk we've talked about technical details, but also we occasionally step into what it feels like, and usually that's where you're making your decisions. So I'm going to get Donald to talk a little bit about that and why that's the case.
Okay, so the statement, we talked about this yesterday as a presentation in the seminar, and I started with a statement that music is magic. We kind of know this instinctively, but it's a bit of a kind of... music can be romantic to our partners, so in that sense, music helps towards the procreation of the species. Music is closely attached to our memory. So if you listen to a song that you heard years ago and you haven't listened to in ages, it doesn't remind you of the things that were happening around then in your mind. It actually transports you back physiologically to how you felt at that time. You don't remember the things, you remember the feeling. You suddenly feel how you felt at that time when you listen to that song loads and love that song loads. There's another one, the classic is the breakup song. So you break up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and there's a particular song that you listen to loads as you're kind of healing from that, and then you move on and life moves on. And then some years later, someone puts that song on again, and you don't go, oh yeah, I listened to that a lot. You suddenly, your body, like, you're transported back to that feeling, that moment. You're like the kind of the pain appears in your body, and the heartbreak, your heart aches a bit, and the regret kind of comes back. So, and that's we all know that. We're all musicians, we're all music professionals. This is why we're here, because music is really powerful. So, and for all the advances of technical and scientific advantages of the humanities and massive achievements, we understand the nervous system of the body. We understand the endocrine system in the body that deals with hormones, that generates hormones, sends them around the body and different parts of the body. There's receptors that receive those hormones, and it's part of the body's internal communication system. And we understand how those hormones change how we feel. But what we don't understand is how the air vibrating in a particular sequence and hitting our ears triggers all of that, and kind of triggers and sends us into these kind of emotional reactions and spaces. And that's what I'm calling a sufficiently advanced technology. That's us. We don't understand it. It's a mystery, and that mystery is magic. So that, that's something I've been mulling over a lot recently. And our work as engineers, it's technical work. We're sound engineers. It's in the title. It's technical. But I think we'll all agree that we do a better job when we bring awareness of that magic and that mystery to our technical work. And we're here to serve the emotional connection. I mentioned it a lot earlier. The emotional connection between the songwriter and the musicians, and the music listener and the audience. Everything we do serves that connection, and that's an emotional connection. So yes, we do all the technical stuff and all the stuff we've learned in our equipment, and that's all really, really, really important. That's our craft. But what the craft serves is emotional. It's heart, it's soul, it's magic. And that affects our decision making. Once in a yoga class, somebody asked my yoga teacher, should we make our decisions with our heads or our hearts? And my yoga teacher thought about it, and she said, you need to make the decision with your head, because your head knows all the facts. It knows all the considerations. It can run the permutations and combinations of what might happen. Your head knows what happened in the past, and you can learn those lessons. Your head can project forward to the future and what might happen. And she said, but then, once you've made the decision, you have to pass it through your heart to check that you've made the right decision, because your heart knows whether that decision was right or not. And so, in the context of your work, so Gethin, if you could just speak about, you talked us through the mastering process. So if you take that awareness into that process and tell us how you work.
In a practical sense, how do we use that? Like, that's fantastic, and it's a great way of thinking about what we all do. We sit right on the border of art and science, which is an awesome place to sit. It's a really exciting place to sit.
It's the privilege of our profession.
Yeah.
Because we bridge both worlds.
But in a practical sense, the way that I use that day to day is that the stuff we were talking about earlier, setting the surgical EQ, setting the threshold, each of those decisions I'm entirely in my head. That's a logical engineering decision. What effect is that having on the sound? Once that's been made, or a part of that decision-making process has been made, you sit back again, and you go back to your blind A/B test with everything at the same volume level. You drop it in, you drop it out. At that point, you stop thinking, oh, maybe that's half a dB, not enough. You just think, is that good? Is that doing good, or is that not doing good? Does it make me feel good, or does it not make me feel good? that is the sort of practical application of what Donald's talking about. That's running it through your heart. And as an engineer, what you actually have to do is get quite quick. It's like you get quite good at code switching. Like, oh, I'm in my technical brain. No, let's take a second. Let's sit back and be in our emotional brain. Okay, move on. Let's go back and do some technical work, and then let's move out again. That's, I think, the discipline, or how I see it for me, of working on that boundary, is that you're stepping in and out. And so what you get very good at is stepping between those two parts. And just to finish off that point, we started this with communication from the client. It's the relationship building, it's the client getting in touch, there being some conversation about what they expect from a session. A session ends in the mirror to that, which is we send a master back to the client, or a series of masters back to the client. We always end with that communication usually ends with, here's version 1, how does it make you feel? Or how do you feel about this? Because you want everyone to have that in their head. You want everyone to have the emotional side of music, the magical side, in their head when they're making their final decisions.
Great. I was going to quickly mention that. So this last part, I'm just going to make one more point before we open up to you for questions. And it's not technical at all, or about mastering or anything, but it does. It's a reflection on the heart thing and being open to the emotional connection, and remembering to come out of our heads to listen to the song with our hearts and our souls as human beings. And the need to be present with the song and present as a human. And actually being present and conscious in modern society is really, really hard, because we live in a capitalist society, we live in a consumer society, there's media, there's politics everywhere, there's noise, there's haste, everybody's struggling a little bit, everything's getting more expensive, inflation is running away, so we, as human beings, we live in a bit of a struggling point in history, and it's hard to kind of to stay present and come back to yourself. I always recommend this, you need to do something. I'm going to talk about me. I've always needed to specifically do something to cultivate that. So what I've ended up with, the practice I do is yoga. I went to yoga classes for years. Now I've got 3 children, so I can't go out so much. But I practice yoga. I get up in the morning before my kids, and I do half an hour of yoga, so that when they get up, my life's a bit easier. But that really helps me. And I go away on retreats 3 or 4 times a year just to get away from everything and practice and come back and remember what it feels like to be just present and conscious and not thinking at 100 miles an hour. For some people, that's meditation. Other people practice Tai Chi. I know Christian people who practice prayer on, do daily prayers. There are lots of different things that you can do to just kind of get out of your head and bring yourself back to the present moment. And I'm very aware of the irony of me, the British guy, sitting here in India telling you guys about heart-centered practices, because, let's face it, cultivating consciousness and being in the present moment is not really part of British culture. But my excuse is I actually learnt it from you guys. My yoga teacher studied at Shivananda Ashram in Kerala, and her 2 gurus back in the UK, one was a Swami from India who left during partition, and the other was a Tibetan monk who walked out of Tibet with the Dalai Lama. So these are Eastern practices I'm talking about. So you guys know this stuff already. So all I'd say is we'd all do well to specifically look for a practice that resonates with you and carve out some time in your life to practice it regularly. Because that makes, that kind of practice makes us happier human beings. Our lives will improve, our relationships will improve, our work will improve, our clients' work will improve. It'll reflect through to the work we pass out. They'll be happier, we'll get more work. So basically, we'll end up happier human beings with more money. So I think that's as good a place to end. So thank you for listening, and we'll open to questions from the floor. And we've got some microphones to
some
go around so
microphones
everybody
coming.
can hear the questions.
Okay, hi. Thanks for the wonderful session, guys. I just want to understand, you spoke about limiting and EQing during the mastering phase. Is it generally what you guys normally do, or like would you dive into the multi-band compressions and the width of the widening the song and stuff like that as well, generally speaking? Without spoiling the sound, like width, I know it interferes with the sound and the phasing issues and a lot of others, it brings a lot of issues. So just want to understand that.
I didn't quite hear the middle section of the question.
I said the first thing, like, do you normally just like limit to just the limiters and the EQing, or is it also about working on the width of the song and multi-band compression, stuff like that, to improve it further?
Shall I start?
I was going to say every song,
Yeah.
or almost every song, has some limiting and some EQ. Every now and again, a song comes through and it just doesn't need anything. So I'll just start with that statement, but then it depends on the song, basically. Do you want to take that a bit further?
Yeah, so those two things that you've identified, definitely. So it depends on the song is where I would start the answer, where Donal left off. There are cases where those things are fantastic. Like widening is definitely something we would look at. I suppose they're all tools. They're all tools available to us. And there's no absolute time in which to use them, but they're definitely in our toolbox would be our answer to that question. There are times when certainly we widen. The things to be aware of when widening is one of those things that will start to affect the balance, the relative balance of what's going on. So that's one to definitely use with care. Multi-band compression, super, super useful. These days, if I'm answering for us in our studio, since the advent of dynamic EQ, so anytime you use a multi-band compressor, what you're dealing with is 2 or 3 crossovers. That's going to introduce phase shifts. That's going to introduce a sort of slight, there will be a shelf to an EQ somewhere at your crossover that maybe you weren't intending. And so just on a purely problem-solving level, the advent of dynamic EQ and good digital implementations of dynamic EQ have meant that we hardly ever reach for a multiband anymore that covers the whole spectrum. But they're really, really super useful tools. So never say never, but use judiciously. The other thing I would add before I pass back to Donal for his further thoughts is just one of the things you can usually think about in mastering is do less. Takes you back to your practice earlier on of going, oh, I've done 5 or 6 different things, and maybe I look at it and go, actually, taking step 3 out, taking step 4 out, things are better. Do less is quite a good rule of thumb sometimes, and I would say wideners and multi-band compressors sometimes fall into that category. But absolutely, they have a place. Sometimes they solve a problem.
And the other thing I'd add is just a word of warning. It's very tempting, especially if you're in a workstation, you're working entirely in the digital domain. Okay, I've done my mix, I've gone away, I've had a cup of tea, I'm coming back, maybe left it a day or two, listen to the mix in different places, come back, I'm now going to master this mix, or you've been handed a mix by someone else to master. I'll just pull in the mastering process, I'll just pull in Ozone and try out a couple of presets and see how it sounds. So that preset, all those presets will have multi-band compression, they'll have widening, they'll have excitement, they'll have some dynamic EQ, they'll have some EQ, they'll have all this stuff on it. But you didn't choose that. So I would say, don't ever touch a preset. Open up that plugin that can do various things, turn them all off, and then sit back and listen to the song. Okay, what do I want to change? Actually, it does feel a bit clumped up in the middle. So yeah, I might at that point, let's widen it. So yeah, the cymbals and the hi-hats are a bit brash. Okay, let me reach for a dynamic processor to control that area. maybe the bottom end's kind of a bit too thick, maybe a high pass, but choose each thing and choose each thing for a specific purpose for what the song needs. So yes, and you might end up with half a dozen different processes in there, but each of those is a conscious choice that you've made to benefit the song, to serve the song, to enhance that emotional connection between the songwriter and the listener. So yes, but not always.
Just as a rule of thumb, do you think widening the song or giving the width to the song should be a part of the mix process, generally speaking?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct? I just want to understand that. Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
quite strongly about this. The setting the stereo stage of the song, that's very much a mix process. A mix process. You choose where everything goes and the width of it. So when people send me a mix, when I'm in a cynical mood, and people send me a mix and say, okay, here's my mix, can you widen it, please? I'm like, why? Why are you sending me a mix to widen when you've got it all there? So yeah, that's, especially when I'm feeling cynical, but then the song is what it is, and if it needs a bit of widening, then so be it, we can roll with that.
Thank you so much.
Hello. So while you were talking about multi-track mastering, you were talking about achieving that consistency than the songs being identical, right? So how do we develop that judgment, and also are there factors to it, and how do these factors change when you work on something like an independent music album, where on a production standpoint the songs may sound very similar, or than Indian movie soundtrack album, where that may not be the case. You have very different kinds of songs. So your insights on that, please.
So to answer the first one, how do you develop the judgment? There's two parts to that answer. The first part is you already have that judgment because you're a human being. You might be a musician. You're certainly you're a fan of music. You love music, or you wouldn't even be in this room or this hall. And music was brought us all together. And you've grown up listening to music, and you feel it and you enjoy it. So to start with, you already have that judgment because you're a music-loving human being. And if the very least you do is make it sound good to you, you're 80 or 90% of the way there. Because that feels good to me. Okay, that's a great start. And beyond that, it's experience. You just learn as you go. You keep doing it. You catch a mistake. And you go, oh, actually, that one I set too loud, or that one I set too. So that'll answer. That's my answer to the judgment thing. Is you already have most of it, and you develop the rest with experience. Do you want to talk about genre differences? In a way that I'm going to dismiss the question, but you'll use the same judgment. So if you're putting together an independent album, you'll be in that mindset when you're doing it. And so perhaps in the film song example is you just make them all loud because the production company wants them all loud. And even the quiet love songs are loud because the love songs are full and they put 150 tracks of various things in it. So perhaps the films, maybe I'm not being too light-hearted, but in my experience, there's in a film album, there's very little difference in actual volume needed. You just stick it all at the same level and it works.
But sometimes quite a tonal difference, actually. Like
yes.
There's quite a bit of tolerance. This is sort of what we meant earlier on by make things sound consistent but not the same. You're not trying to run a frequency analyzer over the whole thing and go, oh, this love song that's all rich vocals and string sections, it doesn't have the same frequency content as this massive bang-in single. It's never going to. That's okay. But it's what we meant by kind of vibe matching. Like the process of mastering is not to make everything sound the same. It's to make it comfortable and nice to listen to all together. I hope that is useful in answering that question.
And the way you double check that is you make all your decisions and then sit back and just put it on in the background. And just listen to it, listen to it concentrating, but also listen to it not concentrating. Go and catch up on emails, go and post on Instagram some photos of the session, or just kind of make a cup of tea. I know I keep saying that. just do something else while you listen to it in the background, and then maybe like something will catch you. Oh, actually, that I wasn't thinking, but that one track is too loud. I'm going to go back and turn it down. So listen consciously, listen in the background, listen unconsciously.
Your subconsciousness is quite a good error checker. It'll wake you up if you're listening to something and suddenly it catches your ear. It'll bring you back. Yeah.
Okay. So I wrote this down. Know where your track is going to go. My question is that essentially my track is going to be played at any medium, and like it is going to be played at a big monitors, big woofers, big like small speakers, small headphones. Now, is my mastering process going to be that I know what sounds good on all over my speakers and how is it sounding on my speakers, so I'll master it according to that? Or is my goal to make it sound as good as it's sounding on my speakers, and then essentially it will fall in place for other things as well? So this is a confusion that I have been having personally. I don't know about others, but this is a core concept. What are you trying to achieve while mastering, essentially?
So it's a fantastic question that comes up quite a lot about translation across different systems. You almost entirely answered it in the second part of your question, but I'm going to pass over to Donal because you put this very well about why we use the speakers we use.
So there's two parts to the answer. One is what we do, and the second is some advice for you. The way we've approached this, it's a critical part, it's one of the most important parts of mastering, is to prepare it so it sounds good everywhere. Our approach to this, and it's a long-term approach, so you can maybe work towards this as you kind of build up your studio, build up equipment, treat your room. So our approach is to make our room and our speakers as absolutely balanced as possible. So that the low end, I mentioned these speakers go down to 19 hertz flat. Everything's in the room, the power amp, it's all set up to give us a really clear and balanced and uncoloured picture of what's going on with the sound. So for us, we just make it sound good in there and try and make sure that all the frequencies are kind of there, not poking out. And then send it out and trust that it then goes out into the world and translates. And it'll take on the character of the playback system it's played on. So if it's balanced going out, and you play it on a small tinny phone speaker, it'll sound small and tinny. If you play it on a sound bar that's a bit boomy, it'll sound a bit boomy. If you play it in a club, which is like deep and strong, it'll sound deep and strong. If you play it on really accurate headphones, it'll sound nice and accurate. So that's when we've done a lot of that work, but really appreciate and respect that at this point in your career, you don't have a room like that. So the counterpoint to that is to know your listening environment, get to know it, make those judgments to the best of your ability there, and then take it elsewhere. Take it out, play it in the car. Take it home, play it on your hi-fi at home. Take it to your parents, play it on their hi-fi. Take it round to your friend's studio, play it on there. Play it on your phone. So just play it in a few different places, and then that thing about taking on the character of the playback device, you'll kind of get that impression over a few of them. And you'll go, okay, sounded good in my studio, but actually on two of those systems that are a bit bass heavy, it's sounding really boomy. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to address that. And then over time, as you do that a few times, you'll go, oh, actually in my room, I know I've got a tendency to push 150 hertz and it gets a bit thick. So as you get to know your room, you'll start knowing when you're mixing, well, actually I'm not going to deliberately not do any pushing there because I know it's got me in trouble further down the line. So kind of learning your room by learning your, going to call it listening environment, that place where you're doing mixing, by checking it in various places. And then you gain confidence. You go, oh, actually, yeah, I know what's going on here. I've done this before. And you've learned a couple, and next time you take it around, you go, actually, yeah, this is pretty good. This is sounding good on all of them, and you've learned your environment. But don't worry about those other places, because when someone plays something on their phone, they expect it to sound small and tinny, and when you go to the club, it's going to sound big and fat and strong. So, trust it to go out into the world, because if you try and anticipate all of those, there are thousands of different ways it can be played back. If you try and anticipate and allow for those, that way madness lies, you can drive yourself crazy. So make it sound as good as it can to you, given the limitations you know about your monitoring, and then trust it to go out into the world and sound good.
Thank you. Can I ask one more? Yeah. So one more question regarding headroom. Essentially, it is advised to leave 4 dBs of headroom, 4 to 5 dBs, or even 2, 3 dBs of headroom for the mastering engineer. But if I talk in theory, if I'm even giving it to you at 1 dB headroom, can't you just simply decrease the clip gain by 2 dBs and it's essentially adding 2 dBs to your headroom? In theory, this should be working fine, I guess, but what's the harm in doing that?
Technically, no harm. 1 dB of headroom would be absolutely fine. You're absolutely right that we could just turn it down. So the real danger is the other way. Don't get too close to 0. So in theory, anything less than 0 is good, but always give us a bit more than that. So the dangers that you run into are things like intersample clipping. So if you start running close, there may be distortions happening that are not showing on your meters, but that might show up. So headroom is good for that reason. Headroom is good, but you're not wrong. We can just turn it down to get 4 or 5 dBs if that's what we want. We're an analog studio, so at some point we're going to come out of a D to A converter, and at that point we're going to recapture. We're going to have an A to D process coming back in, which is going to recapture that digital signal. So you're not wrong, but don't get too close to 0. 1 might be okay. I think 2 to 4 is actually a nice thing to be advised of. The other reason not to worry about it is that we work with very high bit depths earlier on. We were talking about 32-bit float
exactly.
earlier on.
My question was for that only.
So the reason for going up close to 0 is because you're worried about signal to noise ratio. That's the reason for trying to use more bits. You don't really need to do that on a modern. If you're mixing modern music using modern systems, using 32-bit float systems or 24-bit systems, you're not coming close to that dynamic range. So the headroom is nice. The danger is the other way. The danger is 0. So don't get close to it, because there might be things happening that you're not seeing on your monitors, on your meters. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, yeah, I'd say one or two is fine if you're peaking at -1.
Yeah.
For me, so long as it's not hitting the red lights. Yeah, Gethin's right. It's better to be cautious in that direction, because you can drop down, you can deliver at -10, like -12 dBs is 2 bit 6 dB per bit. So if it's 24-bit and you're peaking at -12 dBs, that's still a 22-bit signal, which is way more than anybody can hear. That's kind of that 22 bits is around where the noise floor of the electronics is, like the thermal noise of resistors and capacitors. So there's no need to worry about going down. And like Gethin says, there's dangers to going up. But I'm always comfortable if it peaks at -1. I'm always happy.
Yeah.
Can I go for one more, or does anyone else have question? Cool. I'll go for one more. So when you are approaching a mix that has a song that has many phases to it, let's say few songs, rock songs, or I should not generalize, but few songs are quite similar, uniform from start to end. It does not have many sonic changes or many, stereo imaging changes or dynamic changes. But few songs are very dynamic in terms of that it may have a cross section that is completely sounding like a different song. So essentially it's 3 songs swaying into one song. So how do you approach that? And adding to this question, when you talking about analog chain, I have from my observation, analog chain is used by mostly mastering engineers. I have not seen any mastering studio that is completely digital, but does it not limit you in terms of automation that you are going to do it in different sections of the song? Let's say you have a different analog automation for the chorus, let's say, or for the prelude or anything like that. Can you please elaborate a little on this?
Well, I suppose the first, to take your last section, what we do on the analog is usually broad tone shaping. Automation is not a big part of mastering. It's very, It's not to say we never do things, because in that specific instance that you're talking about, where there are 3 completely different sections, occasionally you will put a split in. You might put a tiny volume shift. You might apply one process to one part of the song and one to another part of the song. In the analog domain, that's not a huge part of mastering. Usually what you're doing is coming up with a path that works for the entire song. It's important to go back to the beginning of what we were saying, which is that we look at the song holistically. If a composer and a series of engineers and musicians have decided that those 3 or 4 sections of a song should be entirely different, they can be entirely different. It would be strange for us to come along right at the end of the process and go, oh, these are too different. You've made too dynamic a contrast. So usually that's not our job. That's not where we bring value.
And we can ask the question.
Yeah.
We can go back. So the aim in mastering is to get one set of settings for the whole song. And if the mix is a good, consistent mix, that one settings will work for the whole thing. If we're at a point where the sections are so different that we're considering mastering them differently, which we can if we want to, just cut them up, do them differently, sew them back together at the end. But that might be a point at which point that might be a good point to get back to the previous person in the chain and say, is this deliberate? Do you want this to be like this? At which point they might say, yeah, that's exactly how we want. Go, great, it's done. Or actually, no, we hadn't thought of it that way. Give me a couple of hours, I'm going to adjust it and send it back to you. So there's room in the communication between different parties to address that, either from our end or from their end, if it's a problem. And chances are it's not, because it's deliberate. And so one mastering pass will cover it.
Last thing.
Can you come back? Can we open it up to the room a bit more? Can we come back to you? So we're going to catch everybody.
Hi, GETHIN. Hi, Donal. So my question is that I believe in the music business, we are here to cater to our clients as per their satisfaction, as per their happiness. But in this process, not forgetting that we are also happy and satisfied with the work or the art that we create. So have you ever come across a situation where working on a certain project, you know that there is more potential to do better, but the client doesn't want to pass that. The client is satisfied at a minimal level. So they want the song to be here, but you know that the song has more potential. So do you talk to the clients, explaining them that there is more potential, or do you just end it there?
Do you want to take it? Shall I start?
Yeah.
And you start?
So I guess it's slightly different in the mastering context, because we're sent the song in the state it's in, and we got an hour or two to do this work. I mean, in that hour or two, I will get it to the very best place I can. So there's no, in just a couple of hours with one fixed fee, I wouldn't stop halfway. I would take it to the ultimate I can. I think that might, in mixing, that might be more of a thing you do the first pass. But then we're professionals, so the first thing we'll do is get it to the point where we're happy. So that I would suggest that's probably the point where you're going to pass it back to your client. And then it definitely comes up. But I would say the communication with the client, I think most people are open to, actually, let's take this forwards. If we spend a bit of time, or if you spend some time, or we do, most creative people are open to that.
I mean, just to go a little bit broader than exactly what your question was, we are a service industry. We are a service provider, and so it's great to be artistically completely fulfilled. You serve the song, as we were saying earlier on, and for us, we can pretty much do that in an hour or two, but you also serve the client. For us, it often happens the other way around, in fact, where you've done something and they ask you to push further or harder rather than less because of the budget, and that's a different question. But yeah, it does happen. It's challenging. Firstly, communication, just going back and having the conversation about why you feel strongly that more could be done. But there's usually time constraints or budget constraints that It's a negotiation
And if
between
it's
your heart and the client's budget.
And if it's a difference in opinion, the bottom line is they're paying. So, yeah, if they're happy, take the money. By all means, have that conversation. Do everything you can to satisfy yourself as a creative person and a musician and an engineer and a human being. But at the point where it's like, if you can feel it, like, yep, great, done, thank you. Here's my bill.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
Hello, sir. Sir, what are your views about using AI mastering tools like Ozone while you're working?
Great topic. Yeah? Yeah. So AI tools, we use them. They're really interesting. Right. The first thing, we use them in mastering all the time. So I'll quite often, if there's one section that's proving problematic with an EQ, I'll use something like Gullfoss from Sound Theory, which does a sort of real-time analysis and suggestion of an EQ curve. Don't take that as absolute truth. You don't have to do what it says, but it's great. It's a friend. It's you saying, I'm really stuck here. What do you think? Run it through something like Gullfoss. It will suggest a solution to you. The Isotope's Ozone Assistant will work in exactly the same way. It'll suggest a solution to you, at which point you as the mastering engineer will go, thank you very much for your suggestions on my bass handling. That's nonsense. I want that kick to be that big. I'm going to ignore everything you've suggested below 200 hertz. But thank you very much. You've given me a really nice way of looking at my mids around 500. Okay, I'm going to turn you off now and go back to my conventional processes, but solve that problem in a way that you've suggested to me. So that's how I think of the AI tools. They're like friends to have a conversation with.
Thank you, sir.
We're just checking that we're okay for time.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. I have one question that you are told that for the album, the consistency and the emotion and connecting the dots in the album is the important key for the mastering the album. But if the songs in the album has different flavors, so what's your thought about the restarting or restarting your process, that if something is work for one song and something all songs are different, but it might be possible that some processing is work for one song and might not be work for other song. So what's your thought about the restarting process and using different tools for different songs?
Do you want to take it or shall I start? Absolutely. It's absolutely fine to use different tools for different tracks, use a different signal path for different tracks in the album. What you've described there will commonly happen. You might get 3 tracks into an album and discover that the first one you started on is not typical of the whole album, and that track 3 puts you in a totally different place. At that point, it is completely valid, and we would do this all the time, to go, okay, maybe I'm going to do 2, 3 more, see what feels right, because there might not just be one type of song on the album. I might want to do something completely different. Restarting is a totally valid decision. You can get to track 3 and go, at some point, I'm going to reapproach track 1. That's fine. Don't be afraid to do it. We do it all the time.
The thing I'd add to that is in between every song, so when we finish working on track 1, we'll reset everything so that we don't start track 2 with the EQ still in from track 1. We start working on track 2 with the EQ flat and the compressor off, and we'll kind of approach it again. But the other side of that coin is using a similar collection of processes is a useful tool in and of itself to get the track sound, to get the feel of the album the same. So that's one of your kind of your backup plans. Is kind of if if nothing else, we'll use the same, if the songs are kind of close enough. So that's one of the reasons we use the tools and stick to it. But yes, if it strays too far, by all means, take this one thing else, put something else. So yeah, be open, be flexible, and start each song from scratch. And that should carry you through.
Yeah.
Hope that answers it.
It's especially true when you have multiple engineers, studios, multiple vocalists on an album. You will encounter that more and more frequently.
It's a judgment call.
Judgment.
So this sounds really close and similar. I'm going to use the same processes. These tracks are all over the place. I'm going to have to throw the book at this and different things for each track. But you'll know when you sit down what to do. Pooja, I think it's time for us to wrap up. So I just want to thank Pooja and Smita and everybody for having... Oh, one last question? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, how do you prepare yourself for a mastering, for a mastering session, mentally? If you need to feel proper, openly, so how do you prepare yourself for that? Mm-hmm. It might happen that something has gone wrong in the other part of your life, and then will that, how you do, restrict that to affect your whatever you feel? How do you train yourself emotionally?
For me personally, that's a very personal question, and the answer will probably depend on you personally. For me, being in this room is part of it. So I mentioned I had 3 children. That can be a stressful roller coaster of a life. But the studio is at my home, but it's in a separate building. So when I leave my home, I'll shut the door behind me, and I've got a 20, 30 meter walk through the countryside, and I get to the studio and I open a new building and I step in. So changing that scenery kind of is the first thing. And I step into that room and I love this room. I'm so lucky to have this room. It's such a great room, and I sit down. So just that change of scenery does it. If I'm so stressed that I don't feel I can start work, so I just don't start work at that point. I'll kind of go, I joke about having tea, but I will have a cup of tea. Or I might go and do some office work or do something else, or go outside and stretch. Or, yeah, it is important. So that thing you say, you can't just sit down in a tense and stressed straight and start working, because you're not feeling it, and you're just making head decisions, possibly angry head decisions. That's right. I'm just going. So, yeah, it's very important to do that, but I don't think I can answer that for anybody else. So that's what I do. I don't know about you, Geth.
Well, I mean, for me, I don't live 20 or 30 meters away from the studio. I live 20 or 30 minutes drive. So I have a decompression time before I walk into that room and start mastering. But I think what might be more relevant, or just one thing to mention, I mean, I have my own, it's my job now. So it's almost like it's Monday at 9:30. I'm coming in. My headspace is going to start getting there anyway. So in the same way, that comes with experience. You kind of get into that headspace. The one thing I would add, because I've got nothing really to add on Donald's conversation, my process is very similar. What I would say is don't change head mode too fast. If you mixed a track, try not to mix it and then immediately master it. Have some decompression or change of mindset between the two. That's the only thing I would add.
Thank you very much. Thanks all for coming. Thank you to Arvind and JK and Mukul for setting it all up. And of course, Pooja and Smita for allowing us to have this at their amazing show.
Thank you, Mr. Donald Whelan, Mr. GETHIN John. Thank you so much for such a wonderful session, for such insightful wisdom. We really appreciate that. Could you please stay on the stage for a moment more while I present you with a token of appreciation?